She leaves on the morning stage, Lionel. Those are the judge's orders, and you will see them carried out." Marshal Lionel Underwood did not move from the doorway of his own jailhouse. He stood there with his broad shoulders filling the frame, his jaw set like iron, his badge catching the last hard light of the August sun dropping behind the red mesa. Deputy Clem Radnor was standing 3 feet back, holding a folded paper that bore the circuit judge's seal, and behind Clem stood 2 hired men from the Hargrove cattle operation, big men, thick-necked, with the kind of eyes that had never once questioned a paycheck. Lionel looked at the paper. He looked at Clem. Then he looked past both of them toward the small room at the back of the jailhouse, where Minnie Collins sat on the edge of a cot, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap with a dignity that seemed almost impossible given everything she had endured in the last 72 hours. "She stays in this town," Lionel said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing about Lionel Underwood that every man in Redrock Flats had learned over 3 years of his marshalling. The quieter he got, the more dangerous the ground beneath your boots. "She stays in this town, and so do I." Clem blinked. "Marshal, the judge's order is worth exactly nothing if it was bought and paid for by Walt Hargrove." Lionel stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him, not slamming it, just easing it shut with a soft, final click that somehow carried more menace than any slam could. "You go back and tell whoever sent you that Minnie Collins is a material witness to a murder committed in my jurisdiction. She does not leave until I say she leaves, and I do not say she leaves." One of the thick-necked men shifted his weight and let his hand drift toward the pistol on his hip. Lionel's eyes moved to that hand, just his eyes. Nothing else moved. The hand went back to the man's side. "You are making a powerful enemy, Marshal," Clem said, and there was something in his voice, not quite a warning, not quite an apology, that told Lionel his deputy already knew which side of this thing he had quietly chosen. "I already have one," Lionel said. "Go on home, Clem." And that was how the proudest, most solitary lawman in the New Mexico Territory of 1883 planted his feet between a frightened woman and a powerful man's wrath, and dared the whole world to move him. But to understand how Lionel Underwood came to say those words with everything he had, with his career and his safety, and something he had not yet named, but could feel pressing against the inside of his chest like a thumb against a bruise, you have to go back 6 days, to the moment a dusty stage rolled into Redrock Flats carrying Minnie Collins and the secret that would tear the town apart. The morning stage from Santa Fe arrived late, as it always did in summer, because the road through Coyote Pass turned to a red paste when the monsoon rains hit the mesas, and the driver had to pick his way through it like a man threading needles. Lionel was standing on the porch of the marshal's office with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the stage lurch into the main street with that familiar exhausted groan of wheels and harness leather. He was 34 years old. He had been marshal of Redrock Flats for 3 years, appointed by the territorial governor after the previous marshal had been quietly encouraged to retire following an incident involving a missing cattle brand and a suspiciously new barn. Lionel had come down from Colorado, where he had served as a deputy in the silver mining town of Creede, and before that he had spent 2 years as a Pinkerton man working cases that took him from Kansas City to the Arizona border. He was experienced. He was thorough. He was, by general agreement of the town's residents, almost aggressively private. He had no wife. He had no close friends. He had a room above the hardware store, a good horse named Beaumont, and a reputation for fairness that even the men he had arrested tended to grudgingly respect. The stage door opened, and 3 passengers got out, a traveling merchant with sample cases, an older man in a minister's collar who moved stiffly from the long ride, and then a woman who stepped down onto the street with a carpet bag in one hand and a small leather satchel in the other, and who straightened up and looked at Redrock Flats with the kind of clear-eyed, careful attention of a person who has learned to assess a new place very quickly, because new places have historically not been kind to her. She was perhaps 26 or 27. She had dark brown hair pulled back under a simple traveling hat, and brown eyes that were large and alert, and set in a face that was pretty in the way that useful things are pretty honestly, without artifice, with a kind of clean symmetry that you noticed and then kept noticing. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been well made once and was now showing the honest wear of a long journey. Lionel noticed her the way he noticed everything, cataloging her without appearing to, filing details. The carpet bag was heavy by the way she carried it. The satchel she held against her body, not swinging it free, which meant there was something in it she considered important. She was looking up and down the street with those careful eyes, and when her gaze passed over him on the porch, it paused for just a fraction of a second before moving on. She went into the hotel. Lionel drank his cold coffee and went back to work. He thought he had catalogued her and filed her away. He was wrong. Her name came to him 2 hours later when Nora Finch, who ran the hotel with her husband Tom, came across the street in a purposeful hurry with her apron still tied, and told Lionel that the new woman was asking a great many questions about the Hargrove cattle operation, and specifically about a man named Davis Price, who had worked there until approximately 3 weeks ago. "What kind of questions?" Lionel asked. "Whether he was still alive," Nora said flatly. Lionel put down his pen. Davis Price had been found at the bottom of a dry canyon 6 miles east of town 11 days ago. His horse had come back alone, and a search party had found the man 2 days later. The official finding, delivered by Doc Hendricks after an examination that Lionel had always privately considered rushed, was that the horse had thrown him and he had broken his neck in the fall. Lionel had written it up that way because the evidence, the boot caught in the stirrup, the horse's scraped knees, the way the body had landed supported it. He had written it up that way, and he had filed it, and he had tried to stop feeling the particular itch at the back of his mind that told him something about it was wrong. He walked to the hotel. The woman was sitting in the small parlor off the lobby, and she stood when he came in, which told him she had been watching the door. Up close, he could see that she was tired in a way that went beyond the stage journey. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of nights with not much sleep, and a tension in the way she held herself that suggested she had been braced for something for a while now. "You are the Marshal," she said. It was not quite a question. "Lionel Underwood," he said. "And you are Minnie Collins." She said her name the way people say things they have decided to be completely straight about. "Davis Price was my brother." Everything became very still. Lionel sat down across from her and he listened, and what Minnie Collins told him in the next hour rearranged every assumption he had made about Davis Price's death and made that itch at the back of his mind bloom into something much larger and more urgent. Davis had written to her 6 weeks ago. The letter had taken 3 weeks to reach her in Santa Fe, where she had been working as a seamstress. In the letter, which she produced from the leather satchel, handling it carefully because it had been read many times, Davis had told her that he had witnessed something on the Hargrove Range. He had been repairing fence line on the northern boundary, alone, 2 hours before sundown, when he had seen Walt Hargrove and 2 of his men with a man he did not recognize, a man from out of the territory, by his dress, and he had watched, from a distance and from cover, as that stranger handed Hargrove a package, and Hargrove handed the stranger a significant amount of cash. That alone would not have been remarkable, but Davis had recognized the stranger. He had seen him before in the town of Las Cruces at the county land office, where the man worked as a recording clerk. Davis had not known what the exchange meant, but he had been frightened enough to write to his sister, and he had been frightened enough to be considering leaving the Hargrove operation. 3 weeks after writing the letter, Davis Price was dead. Lionel read the letter twice. He looked up at Minnie Collins, who was watching him with those large, careful eyes. "You rode 6 days from Santa Fe to bring me this," he said. "I did not ride," she said. "I took the stage, and it took longer than 6 days because I had to wait 3 days in Albuquerque for a connection." A pause. I am here because my brother is dead and I do not believe he fell off a horse. Davis grew up riding. He was on a horse before he could walk properly. Mrs. Collins, Miss Collins, she said, I am not married. Miss Collins, he held the letter. This suggests Hargrove may have been purchasing fraudulent land documents. It does not prove murder. No, she said steadily, but it gives him a reason for one. She was right. It did. Lionel gave the letter back to her. He told her to stay in the hotel and not to discuss her brother or her reasons for coming with anyone. He told her he would look into it. He told her these things in the careful, even tone he used for official business, and she listened to them with a polite attentiveness that told him she was filing them away just as carefully as he filed things, and that she was reserving judgment about how much she trusted him. He went back to his office and sat for a long time. Then he went to see Doc Hendricks. Doc Hendricks was 61 and had been in Redrock Flats since before it was properly a town, when it was still just a water stop and a trading post, and a cluster of adobe buildings that blew dust at you from every angle. He was a good doctor for everyday ailments. He was less good at situations where his findings might inconvenience powerful men, and Walt Hargrove was the most powerful man in the county, employing 40 riders and running cattle on land that stretched for 40 miles in 3 directions. Lionel asked Doc specific questions about the examination of Davis Price's body. He asked them carefully, the way a man takes apart a watch, not forcing anything, just lifting each piece out gently and looking at it. And Doc Hendricks answered the questions with increasing discomfort, picking at the edge of his desk blotter, until Lionel asked whether there had been any bruising inconsistent with a fall from a horse, and Doc Hendricks went very quiet. There was bruising at the wrists, Doc said finally, both wrists, consistent with binding. Lionel sat very still. And you did not include that in your report. Walt Hargrove, Doc started, was not present at that examination. No, Doc looked at his hands, but his foreman was. Carl Meade was there before you arrived. He told me the horse had a history of throwing riders and that Davis had been warned. He was very, Doc paused. He was very clear about what the conclusion should be. Lionel rode out to the canyon the next morning before dawn. He took Beaumont at a careful pace, and he went back over the site with the new information pressing against everything he looked at. He found what he had been afraid he would find: a second set of boot prints, different from Davis Price's, on the canyon rim above where the body had been found, deep-heeled, heavy, the kind a large man makes when he is carrying weight. The prints led to a place where a horse had stood. He could see the scrape of a hoof in the dirt, and then went back. They did not lead to the path down into the canyon. A man had stood on that rim and thrown Davis Price over it, or dropped him. Either way, it was murder, and the evidence, thin as it was, pointed directly at Walt Hargrove's operation. He rode back to town with a cold, clear feeling in his chest, and a problem that was significantly larger than he had expected when he walked into the hotel the previous afternoon. He went to the hotel. Minnie Collins was in the parlor again, sitting at the small writing desk with what appeared to be a list she was making, because she was the kind of person who made lists when she was worried. He would come to know this about her in the days ahead. She looked up when he came in. He told her what he had found. He told her all of it directly, because she had a right to know, and because he could already tell that handling her gently in the sense of withholding things would not work. She was too sharp and she had come too far. She did not cry. She had clearly already done her crying at some earlier point in private, and she had moved past it into something harder and more purposeful. She said, "What do we do?" He noticed the we. He told himself it was appropriate. She was a witness. She was involved. It was natural for her to frame it that way. He told himself this while noticing the way the morning light from the parlor window fell across her face and made the shadows under her eyes look like something he wanted, for reasons he could not have explained, to erase. "I need to build a case," he said, carefully. "If I move too fast, Hargrove's lawyer will dismantle it before it reaches a judge. I need the land clerk from Las Cruces. I need someone to corroborate your brother's account of what he saw." "Do you have a deputy?" she asked. I do, Clem Radnor, he has been here for years, he paused. I trust him adequately. Minnie looked at him with the directness that he was already beginning to recognize as characteristic. That is not the same as trusting him. No, he admitted. It is not. He went back to his office, and he sent a wire to the land office in Las Cruces, requesting information about a recording clerk, matching the description Davis had provided, a tall man, fair-haired, with a scar across his left chin. He sent the wire through the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe rather than through the local relay, because he was not certain who in Redrock Flats had connections to Hargrove, and he was not willing to tip his hand before he was ready. The wire response came back the following day. The clerk matching that description was a man named Theodore Greer, and he had abruptly resigned from his position at the land office 3 weeks ago. His last known address was in Las Cruces, but he had not been seen there since his resignation. 3 weeks ago, the same week Davis Price had died, Lionel worked through the pattern. Hargrove had purchased fraudulent land documents, probably false deeds establishing prior claim to range land that was either disputed or about to be homesteaded, a common corruption in the territory during this period of rapid settlement. Davis had seen the transaction. Davis had written to his sister. Hargrove or his people had found out, perhaps intercepted the letter, perhaps noticed Davis behaving differently, and had silenced him. Then Greer had been encouraged to disappear, removing the other link in the chain. What Hargrove had not counted on was Minnie Collins being the kind of woman who actually came. The third day after her arrival, Minnie did not stay in the hotel. Lionel had asked her to stay in, but she was not a woman who accepted confinement gracefully, and when he found her mid-morning she was at the dry goods store, buying thread and some basic sewing supplies. She had, apparently, already spoken to the hotel owner's wife about doing alterations and mending for the hotel's laundry service in exchange for a reduced rate on her room, because her funds were limited, and she intended to stay as long as necessary. He should have been frustrated. He found, to his own slight confusion, that he was not. "I told you to stay in the hotel," he said, not very sternly, standing beside her at the dry goods counter while she examined a spool of thread with great concentration. "You did," she agreed pleasantly. "It was for your safety." "I know." She set the thread down and looked at him with those clear brown eyes. "Marshal Underwood, I have been taking care of my own safety since I was 17 years old. I understand the risk. I'm also not going to sit in a small room and wait. I'm not built for that." She picked up the thread again. "I will be careful. I will not speak about why I am here, but I am going to be useful while I am useful." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Fine," in a tone that he was aware might have sounded closer to admiration than disapproval, and he walked out. That evening, he found himself thinking about her in a way that was not professionally appropriate. He noticed this and addressed it internally with the same efficiency he applied to other problems, which is to say he told himself to stop it and then continued thinking about her anyway. She came to his office on the 4th day, at mid-morning, with a cup of coffee in each hand. She had been to the cafe across the street, and she sat down across from his desk with a directness that suggested she had something to say and had thought carefully about how to say it. "I spoke to a woman yesterday," she said. "Ellen Crosby. She does washing for some of the Hargrove writers. She told me that 3 weeks ago, the week Davis died, 2 of Hargrove's men, she knew them as Carl Meade and a man called Dutch, came back to the bunkhouse very late with mud on their boots and their horses lathered. She thought nothing of it at the time. She thought of it after." Lionel set down the coffee slowly. "That is corroboration of movement. It is not proof." "No, but it is another piece." He looked at her. "How did you get her to tell you this?" Minnie looked slightly amused for the first time since he had met her. It changed her face in a way that did something unexpected to the air in the room. "I helped her with the washing while we talked." "People talk while their hands are busy. It is a thing I have always found true." He stared at her. "You are very good at this," he said. She looked slightly startled, as if she had expected some other reaction, caution perhaps, or disapproval. "My brother is dead," she said after a moment. I am going to find out who did it." "You are," he said, "but you are going to let me do it in a way that holds up in front of a judge. Will you trust me to do that?" There was a pause. She studied him the way she had studied the thread at the dry goods store, carefully, taking in the detail. "Yes," she said finally, "I will trust you." He did not fully understand at that moment what those 3 words cost her. He would come to understand it later, when she told him about the man in Santa Fe, a man named Gerald Peck, a land agent, who had hired her as a seamstress, and who had, over the course of 2 years, gradually managed to make her believe she was less capable and less worthy of trust than she actually was, until Davis's death had cracked something open in her, and she had come to Redrock Flats and slowly, in the desert light, begun to remember what she was actually made of. She did not tell him that story yet, though. That came later. On the 5th day, Lionel made his error. He confided in Clem Radnor. He did not tell Clem everything. He held back the specifics of the land document theory and Ellen Crosby's account. But he told Clem enough. He told him there were questions about Davis Price's death, and that Minnie Collins had brought information that suggested it may not have been an accident. He told Clem because Clem was his deputy, and because he needed someone to cover the office while he rode out to investigate the northern range boundary where Davis had been working. Clem listened. He nodded. He said the right things about justice and proper process. That evening, Walt Hargrove rode into town. Lionel had met Hargrove 3 times in 3 years. He was a big man, somewhere in his mid-50s, with silver hair and a broad face that had the ruddy, weather-scoured look of a man who had spent decades outdoors, or, more accurately, of a man who had once spent time outdoors, and had since spent most of his time sitting in a comfortable office directing the men who worked outdoors on his behalf. He wore good clothes, and he had the easy confidence of a man who had never, in recent memory, encountered a problem that money could not resolve. He came into Lionel's office alone, which was itself a kind of statement. He did not need the backup because he did not consider Lionel a serious obstacle. "Marshal," he said pleasantly, "I hear you have been asking questions about Davis Price." Lionel folded his hands on the desk. "I am always asking questions. It is the nature of the work." "Of course." Hargrove sat down without being invited. "Terrible thing, that accident. Good worker, Price. Unfortunate he was not a better horseman." His eyes were calm and watchful. "I also hear there is a woman in town. His sister." Lionel said nothing. "It is perfectly natural she would be grieving," Hargrove said, "and perhaps looking for someone to blame. Grief does that to people, makes them see things that are not there." He paused. "I would hate for a grieving woman to cause trouble in this town, stir things up, make accusations that could not be supported. That kind of thing can go badly for everyone involved." "Is that a concern you are raising as a citizen?" Lionel asked mildly. "As a concerned member of this community," Hargrove said. "This town depends on my operation, Marshal. 40 men employed. Supply contracts with every business on this street. I'm not telling you anything you do not know." "No," Lionel agreed. "You are not." Hargrove stood. He smoothed his jacket. "I trust we understand each other." "I trust that as well," Lionel said. After Hargrove left, Lionel sat for a long moment in the silence of the office. Then he went directly to the hotel. Minnie was in her room. She had heard that Hargrove had ridden in word traveled fast in a small town, and she was standing at the window with her arms crossed, watching the street. She turned when Lionel knocked and was admitted. "He knows I am here," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, someone told him." Lionel kept his voice even. "My deputy, most likely. I misjudged him." "What does that mean for us?" she asked. The us again, unself-conscious, natural. He filed it away. "It means we move faster," he said. "I was going to wait for more evidence. I no longer have that luxury." He looked at her directly. "It also means you are in danger, real danger." Hargrove made that clear enough without saying it plainly. She did not flinch. "I was in danger the moment Davis died," she said. "I just did not know it yet." He wanted to tell her to leave. He understood, looking at her, that telling her to leave would accomplish nothing except making her feel dismissed and would probably result in her staying anyway through sheer force of will. He made a decision instead. "I am going to move you," he said. "Not out of town. Into the jailhouse. There is a room at the back. It locks from the inside and the outside, and I can see it from my desk." He paused. "I know that is not an appealing proposal." "It is perfectly fine," she said steadily. "I have stayed in worse places than a jailhouse room." He helped her carry her things across the street that evening, under a sky that had turned the deep amber-violet color that the New Mexico desert produced in the hour before dark. A color so extravagant it always seemed slightly unearned by the flat, dust-colored landscape that produced it. They walked side by side, and she carried her own carpet bag without offering it to him, and he carried the satchel. And it occurred to him that this was the closest he had been to a woman in a considerable amount of time. She stopped on the jailhouse step and looked up at the sky. "It is a beautiful place," she said. "I did not expect that. I thought it would be ugly." "Most people think that," he said, "about desert country. It is not, though." She looked at the mesa, turned dark red in the failing light. "There is something honest about it. There is not much to hide behind." He thought about that while he was showing her the back room, which was small and contained a cot, a washstand, and a window that faced an alley. It was not luxurious. She looked it over with the pragmatic eye of a woman who has learned to make do and said it was fine. He gave her the inside key. He built up the stove in the main office and left the door between the two rooms open 3 inches so that warmth could get in. He tried to sleep in the office chair and managed about 4 hours. In the morning she was already awake when he opened his eyes. She had made coffee on the office stove. She had found the tin and the pot and figured it out with the quiet competence she brought to everything. And she set a cup on the desk in front of him with a simplicity that felt, in that dusty early morning light, more intimate than it had any right to. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for the room," she said. She sat across from him with her own cup, and they drank their coffee in a silence that was comfortable in a way that surprised him. He had always found silence with other people slightly effortful, requiring management. This silence managed itself. "Tell me about your brother," he said, because it was information he needed and also because he wanted to know. She told him. Davis had been 3 years younger. They had grown up in Missouri, in a small farming community, and their father had died when Minnie was 14, which had meant that she and Davis and their mother had spent several years in a state of genteel struggle that had given all of them a very practical relationship with hard work and very little patience for waste of any kind. Their mother had died 4 years ago. Davis had headed west looking for range work because the cattle industry was booming and he was good with horses. Minnie had gone to Santa Fe, where a cousin had connections in the tailoring business, and she had built herself a life as a seamstress. "Were you happy?" he asked, and then felt slightly exposed by the directness of the question. She considered it seriously rather than deflecting. "I was competent," she said, which is not the same thing but is often mistaken for it. She looked into her cup. "I had made myself into someone who was very good at managing." I am not certain I had thought much about happiness as a separate category. He understood this more than he could easily have explained. He told her about Colorado, about the years in Creed, where the silver money had made the town wild and the violence had been frequent and depressingly predictable, about the Pinkerton work, which had taken him across enormous distances and taught him a great deal about human nature and left him feeling, at the end of it, somewhat disconnected from the kind of ordinary life that the people he investigated and protected seemed to be living without much effort. About coming to Redrock Flats, where the pace was slower and the work was more manageable and where he had told himself he was content. "Are you?" she asked, with the same serious attention she had given his question. He looked up. "Competent," he said, "but perhaps not happy as a separate category." She met his eyes. Something moved between them, quiet and charged, like the feeling in the air before a lightning storm, not the storm itself, just the pressure that tells you it is coming. He looked away first. On the sixth day, the circuit judge's order arrived. Minnie was to be escorted out of the territory on the morning stage. The order bore the proper seal and signature, and it cited Minnie as a disruptive presence making unsubstantiated accusations against a prominent citizen. The language was careful and legal and absolutely bought, and Lionel knew it the moment Clem brought it in with those two Hargrove men behind him. And so he stood in the doorway of his jailhouse, and he said the words that would define everything that came after. She stays in this town. And so do I. He meant it in the practical sense. He was not going to be moved from his jurisdiction by a fraudulent court order, and he was not going to let a woman be removed who was the only material witness to a murder. He meant it with the cold, clear certainty of a man who has done his legal reasoning and knows where he stands. But he also meant it in the other sense, the one he had not yet fully acknowledged to himself, which was that the thought of Minnie Collins boarding that stage and disappearing back into a world he could not see was not something he was willing to process. He sent the deputy and Hargrove's men away. He closed the door. He went to the back room where Minnie had heard everything through the 3-inch gap. She was standing, not sitting, her hands loose at her sides, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read: relief and something else, something softer and more complicated. "You could lose your badge over this," she said. "I could. That did not stop you." "No, why not?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely wanting to know. He looked at her for a moment and then he said the most honest thing he had said in a very long time. Because it was the right thing to do, and because he stopped, and because she prompted gently. "And because I am not done yet," he said, which was not entirely what he had intended to say but was close enough to the truth to stand. She nodded slowly. A pause. Then, "Neither am I." He sent a wire to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe that day, marked urgent, requesting a federal deputy, and laying out the evidence in plain, precise language: Doc Hendrix's omitted finding, the boot prints on the canyon rim, Ellen Crosby's account of Meade and Dutch returning late, the land document theory and the letter Davis had written, the fraudulent court order that had been served that morning. He sent it through a private writer, a young man named Santos who ran messages for several of the town's businesses and who Lionel trusted because Santos had no connection to Hargrove and a reliable dislike of powerful men after a land dispute that had cost his family their small holding 2 years prior. Santos rode out before noon. Hargrove would know the order had not been carried out within hours. Lionel knew this. He prepared for what would come next the way he prepared for everything, methodically, without drama, going through his options and his resources with the same care a carpenter checks his tools. He had 2 good rifles in the gun rack. He had his Colt single-action Army revolver, which he was accurate with at distances most men would not attempt. He had 30 rounds for the rifles and 40 for the pistol. He had Beaumont, who was fast and steady. He had a jailhouse with solid adobe walls that could stop rifle fire if it came to that. He had Minnie Collins, who was not a resource in the military sense but who had already demonstrated a quality of clear thinking under pressure that he found, there was no other word for it, remarkable. He told her the situation plainly that evening. He told her he had sent for federal help. He told her it would take 2 to 3 days at minimum for help to arrive. He told her that in the meantime Hargrove would likely escalate. She listened. She asked practical questions. She asked whether the town itself would take a position, and he told her honestly that it was unlikely. These things followed money, and Hargrove's money was deep in this town's pockets. "Ellen Crosby might speak," she said, "if there was a proper hearing. She might, but I need her alive to do it." "Can you warn her?" He thought about it. "I can send her a message." Quietly, he looked at Minnie. "You are thinking like an investigator." "I am thinking like a woman who wants the man who killed her brother to answer for it," she said, without any particular heat, just with the flat, even clarity that he had come to recognize as her version of deep feeling. She did not flare up. She went very still and very clear when something mattered to her most. He sent the message to Ellen Crosby through Nora Finch at the hotel, who was, it turned out, entirely ready to be useful against Hargrove, whose men had caused enough trouble in her hotel over the years that she had a private account of grievances she was willing to contribute to the cause. That night, Lionel sat at his desk long after Minnie had retired to the back room. The lamp was low. The town outside was quiet. From somewhere far out on the mesa, a coyote made its thin, lonely sound, and the dark pressed in against the windows. He thought about the look on Minnie's face when he had told Clem and Hargrove's men that she stayed. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like the expression of a person who had not expected something and then received it anyway, and did not yet know what to do with the receiving. He thought about the way she had said, "Yes, I will trust you," and what that meant from someone who had clearly learned not to say it easily. He thought about the way it had felt entirely inappropriately, entirely without any professional basis to carry her satchel across the street in the amber evening light. He told himself to go to sleep. He did not go to sleep for some time. Two things happened the following morning in quick succession, and both of them changed the shape of the next 48 hours. The first thing was that Carl Meade rode into town alone. He came without Hargrove, without Dutch, without any of the usual entourage. He came in the early morning before most of the street was awake, and he came straight to the jailhouse, which was itself startling enough that Lionel had his hand on his pistol before Meade was through the door. But Meade was not armed. He had left his gun belt outside, which was a gesture whose significance was not lost, and his face had the tight, controlled look of a man who has made an uncomfortable decision and is now committed to living with it. "I need to talk to you," Meade said. "About Davis Price." Lionel said nothing for 3 full seconds, reading the man. Then he stepped back from the door and let him in. What Carl Meade told him, in a voice that stayed low and controlled except for one moment near the end when it broke slightly, was that he had been present on the canyon rim the night Davis Price died. He had not pushed Davis. That had been Dutch Carver, whose real name was Willem Vanderhook, a man Hargrove had brought in from Texas specifically because he had a history of solving problems in ways that left little evidence. Meade had stood on the rim and he had not stopped it, which he knew made him complicit in a legal sense and in every other sense. And he had spent the last 11 days not sleeping properly and coming to the conclusion that he could not go on this way. He did not use the word conscience. He said simply, "I cannot keep doing this." Lionel asked him if he would say this to a federal judge. Meade said yes. He said it without hesitation, which told Lionel this was a decision that had been made long before this morning. He put Meade in a cell not locked. He left the cell door open because Meade had come voluntarily, and locking him up at this point would be both unkind and counterproductive to the trust the man had just placed in him, and he went to the back room door and knocked. Minnie opened the door. She looked at him with immediate attention. "One of Hargrove's men just confessed," he said quietly. "Carl Meade. He was there the night your brother died. He says a man named Dutch Carver killed Davis." Minnie put one hand against the door frame just for a moment. Then she straightened. "Is he willing to testify?" "He is." Something moved across her face, a brief, compressed thing that contained grief and relief and anger all at once, and then she pressed her lips together and nodded. "Good," she said. "That is good." The second thing that happened that morning was that Dutch Carver came to take Meade back. He came with 2 other Hargrove riders, all 3 of them armed and riding fast down the main street at a time when the street was still quiet enough that several citizens, looking out their windows, decided to step away from them quickly. Lionel heard the horses and was at the door before they reached it. Dutch Carver was a large man, heavier than Meade, with pale eyes and a physical confidence that came from having successfully intimidated people for many years. He reined in his horse 20 feet from the jailhouse door and looked at Lionel with those pale eyes. "I am here for Meade," he said, "not a request. Meade is a guest of this office," Lionel said. He was standing in the doorway with his arms loose at his sides and his coat pushed back from his gun belt, not because he was planning to draw, but because the information that he could draw was relevant to the conversation. He is here of his own will. Hargrove wants him back. I imagine he does, Lionel said pleasantly. Meade, however, does not appear to want to go back to Hargrove, and since he is a free man who has not been charged with anything, that settles it. Carver's jaw tightened. His hand moved toward his hip. That would be a serious mistake, Lionel said quietly. From behind him, from just inside the door, in the shadow of the office, came a sound that was distinct and unmistakable in the West of 1883. The sound of a rifle being cocked. Carver's eyes shifted to the shadow. Minnie Collins stood just inside the office door with Lionel's spare Winchester rifle held correctly, properly shouldered, properly sighted, the stock firm against her cheek. She had found it in the gun rack and she was holding it with the calm, steady grip of someone who had grown up in Missouri farm country and knew perfectly well how to use such a thing. Carver stared at her. His two companions looked at each other. Lionel did not look at Minnie. He kept his eyes on Carver. But he was aware of her presence at his back with a feeling that had nothing to do with professional partnership, a warmth that pressed through the back of his jacket like held heat. You will ride back to the Hargrove Ranch, Lionel said, and you will tell Walt Hargrove that Carl Meade is under my protection, that a federal deputy is on the way to this town, and that his arrangement with the circuit judge will not save him from federal jurisdiction. You will also tell him, Lionel paused, measuring the next words carefully. You will tell him that Dutch Carver has been identified as the man who murdered Davis Price, and that I am placing him under arrest for that murder as of this moment. A very long silence. Then Lionel said, Dutch Carver, put your hands up. And Carver, to his own evident surprise and the surprise of his companions, put his hands up, because Lionel Underwood's voice in that moment did not leave room for any other option, and because the rifle behind him was steady and the man in the doorway was steadier still, and because the combination of those things was more than Carver's pragmatic self-preservation could discount. Lionel disarmed him. He put him in the cell, this one he locked. The other two Hargrove riders turned their horses and rode back the way they had come. When the street was quiet again, Lionel turned around. Minnie had lowered the rifle and was leaning it carefully back against the wall beside the door. Her hands were entirely steady, her face was composed. But when she looked at him, something in her eyes was not entirely composed, something that had been wound very tight was letting go slightly. You knew how to use that, he said. I grew up on a farm, she said. My father taught both of us. Davis was better than me. She paused. He was better at most things than me. Not at choosing a sister, Lionel said. It came out before he had decided to say it. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not file away as something professional or convenient. It was soft and direct, and it went through whatever careful distance he had been maintaining with the efficiency of something very small and very sharp. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded and went to see to Carver's securing, which was entirely necessary and also gave him something to do with his hands. The federal deputy arrived at noon the following day. A man named Aguilar, compact and quick-eyed, who had ridden hard from Albuquerque and arrived with the dust of several counties on his jacket. Lionel briefed him for an hour, laying out the evidence in the orderly sequence that made it most useful legally. The letter, the boot prints, Hendrix's omitted findings, Ellen Crosby's account, and now Carl Meade's full confession, which Meade had given formally in writing that morning with Lionel witnessing it. Aguilar read everything with a thoroughness that Lionel respected. Then he looked up and said, The circuit judge's order against the Collins woman, that will need to be voided. That is my expectation, Lionel said. Aguilar nodded. It will be. This is a federal matter now. The fraudulent land documents alone put it in our jurisdiction, and the murder of a witness puts it well beyond any circuit court. He paused. You did well, Marshal, holding this together without letting it break. Lionel said he had not held it alone, and he said it simply, the way a man states a fact. Aguilar arrested Walt Hargrove that afternoon. He rode out to the ranch with Lionel and two witnesses, Santos and a townsman named Porter who ran the feed store, and had his own reasons to dislike Hargrove, involving a grain contract that had not been honored. Hargrove came out of his house with the confident fury of a man who has never been arrested and cannot quite believe it is happening, and he was still making threats about lawyers and judges when the handcuffs went on. Lionel watched it happen and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing being completed correctly, a satisfaction that was clean and settled rather than triumphant. They rode back to town. Minnie was standing in the doorway of the jailhouse when they returned, and when she saw Hargrove in handcuffs on a horse, she went very still for a moment. Then she looked at Lionel. He gave her a small nod. She looked away, out toward the mesa, and the expression on her face was something he thought he might carry with him for a long time. That evening the town exhaled. The word moved up and down the street: Hargrove taken, Dutch Carver jailed, a federal hearing to come. Ellen Crosby came to the jailhouse of her own initiative and sat down with Deputy Aguilar and gave a clear, complete account that corroborated everything. Doc Hendricks came in the morning and filed an amended death report that accurately reflected his original findings, and the shame in his face was genuine enough that Lionel found he had no desire to add to it. Carl Meade would face reduced charges in exchange for his testimony. Dutch Carver would not. The federal proceedings would take several months to fully resolve, and there would be lawyers and depositions and a great deal of territorial legal machinery engaged in the process. But Aguilar was confident in the case, and Lionel, reading the evidence the way he read all evidence, agreed. What happened next, though, was the thing that Lionel had not planned for. Minnie came to his office in the early evening of the day after Hargrove's arrest, and she sat down across from his desk with the look of someone who has been thinking about something carefully and has arrived at a place that requires honesty. "I should discuss my plans," she said. "Now that the immediate situation is—" She paused, searching for the word. "Resolved." "Yes," he said. He was very still. "I could go back to Santa Fe," she said. "There will be more to deal with, depositions and the like, so I cannot leave the territory. But I could go back to the city and—" "You could stay here," he said. He said it the same way he had said she stays to Clem Radnor, quietly, clearly, without equivocation. Minnie stopped. "There is work here," he said. He was aware that he was not handling this with the eloquence the situation probably deserved, but he could not seem to stop himself from the plain truth of it. Nora Finch has already mentioned that the town does not have a proper seamstress. And there is— He stopped, tried again. "Miss Collins, Minnie." It was the first time he had used her first name. He watched her register it. "I would like you to stay, not as a witness or a material consideration in a case. I would like you to stay because—" A pause, the longest pause he could remember. "Because this last week has been the least solitary I have felt in a very long time, and I find I am not willing to return to what I had before it without at least saying that plainly." The office was very quiet. The late light came through the window and lay across the desk between them. Minnie looked at him. Her hands were folded in her lap and her chin was level and her eyes were bright, he realized. Not wet, just bright, with a kind of contained interior light. "That is the most you have said at once since I arrived," she said. "It is," he agreed. "You are asking me to stay in Redrock Flats." "I am, because you find it less solitary." "Yes." A silence. Then, "Lionel." It was the first time she had used his name. He felt it the way you feel a hand pressed briefly against your arm, specific, warm, deliberate. "I came here because my brother was dead, and I needed someone to help me find justice for him. I did not come here expecting." She gestured slightly, a small movement that encompassed the desk between them and the two of them sitting at it and everything that had accumulated in the last 6 days. "But I find that what I expected and what has happened are not the same thing at all." "No," he said, "they are not." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I would need proper accommodation, not the jailhouse room." "Of course," he said. Nora Finch has rooms at the hotel for reasonable rent, and there is a woman at the edge of town, Mrs. Beaumont, no relation to my horse, who rents a small house. The house sounds better, Minnie said, almost to herself. Then she looked at him directly. And I would need time. I am not, she paused, and he understood that she was navigating something that had been left difficult by whatever had happened in Santa Fe, some damage done to her sense of her own worth or judgment that she was still in the process of repairing. I do not move quickly in these matters. I hope that is all right. I have been a patient man my entire adult life, he said. I expect I can continue to be one. Something in her face shifted, a relaxing of the last remaining held thing, and she smiled, really smiled for the first time in his presence, with warmth and a slight edge of self-deprecation, and it transformed her face completely and went directly through every remaining professional consideration he had been using to manage himself. Then I will stay, she said, for a while, and we will see. We will see, he agreed. And for a man who liked certainty, he found that the uncertainty of those 3 words felt remarkably all right. She moved into the small house at the edge of town the following week. It was a simple adobe house with 2 rooms and a good window that faced south and caught the light well, which mattered for sewing. She brought her carpet bag and her satchel, and the few things she had accumulated, and she set up her sewing table in the south room and her cot in the other, and she hung a calico curtain at the good window and pronounced herself satisfied. Lionel helped her carry the sewing table, because it was awkward and heavy. He did not make a project of helping her settle in. He understood that she needed to establish this space as hers, and hovering would have undermined that. But he helped with the table, and then stayed for a cup of coffee that she made on the small cast-iron stove, and they sat at the 2 chairs that had come with the house, and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. In the easy way of 2 people who have already been through something together and are discovering that the thing between them extends beyond the circumstances that created it. He came back the next evening, and the one after that. He did not rush her. He was, as he had promised, patient, which was partly his nature and partly the fact that he was, despite the quiet certainty with which he had asked her to stay, genuinely uncertain about himself in this particular territory. He was expert in law and order and the management of difficult situations. He was not expert in this. She was patient with his uncertainty in the way that a person who has been through their own version of damage tends to be patient with the damage in others, recognizing the shape of it, not trying to force it open. They took to walking in the evenings when his work allowed. Redrock Flats in the evening was a different town than it was in the heat of the day. The light did the thing it always did out here, turning everything amber and rose, making the ordinary buildings look briefly extraordinary, and the air cooled enough to breathe properly. They walked to the edge of town and looked at the mesa and talked, or did not talk, and the weeks turned and the season changed, and the case against Hargrove moved through its federal proceedings with the ponderous certainty of an institution with a solid foundation under it. They went to Davis's grave together one afternoon, 6 weeks after Minnie had arrived. Davis had been buried in the Redrock Flats cemetery in the dry plot east of town, and Minnie had ordered a stone from the stonemason with her own careful savings. A plain granite marker with his name and dates, and nothing else, because she had not yet decided what else to say, and she did not want to say the wrong thing. They stood at the grave in the afternoon quiet, and she did not cry, but she put her hand briefly on the stone and said something under her breath that was not meant for Lionel to hear, and he stood slightly back and gave her the privacy of the moment without abandoning it. Walking back, she took his arm. She did it matter-of-factly, without comment, simply put her hand in the crook of his elbow as they walked back along the dry road. He felt it all the way to his boots. He covered her hand with his briefly, and she let him, and neither of them said anything about it. That night he sat in his office after hours and tried to think about what he wanted to say and how to say it, which was the longest and least productive official inquiry he had ever conducted. He said it the following Sunday, which was a slow day, when he walked to her house and found her on the small porch with her mending, because she always had mending. He sat down on the step beside her and said, "I would like to court you properly, if that is agreeable to you." She set her mending down and looked at him with those brown eyes that had gone from careful and guarded in the hotel parlor 6 weeks ago to something much warmer, something that held more of the interior light he had noticed the evening he asked her to stay. "It is agreeable to me," she said. "I was wondering when you were going to say it." He looked at her. "You were waiting." "I was," she admitted. "I did not think it was my place to say it first." A pause. "Although I was becoming impatient." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that surprises the person doing it, and she looked delighted by it in the way that people are delighted when someone reveals an unsuspected warmth. He realized, sitting on her porch in the Sunday quiet with her mending in her lap, that he had not laughed like that in years. He went to her door the next Saturday evening with his hat in his hands cleaned and pressed, his best shirt, boots polished, and he asked her to dinner at the cafe across from the marshal's office. She came out in a blue dress that she had made herself, he suspected, because it fit her with the precision that only a seamstress achieves for herself, and she looked. He searched for the word and found the only accurate one: lovely, in the clear, honest way that the desert was lovely, without contrivance, with a beauty that rewarded looking properly. He offered her his arm and they walked across the street, and the town noticed, because small towns always notice, and Nora Finch, watching from the hotel window, smiled in a way that required no commentary. They had dinner and they talked about books. She had brought 3 with her from Santa Fe and had borrowed 4 more from the schoolteacher's wife who shared her taste in novels, and about her brother, whom she spoke about more easily now, with the particular soft grief that comes after the sharp grief, and about what she wanted her life to look like in a year, in 5 years, in the long run. "I want it to be useful," she said. "I have always wanted my life to be useful. But I also want," she turned her coffee cup in her hands, "I want it to be mine, properly mine, not shaped entirely around someone else's needs." He understood this as something she was not only saying in the general sense. He looked at her. "That would not be a problem," he said carefully, "if you were with someone who respected what was yours." She met his eyes. "No," she agreed. "It would not." They walked home slowly under a sky full of the particular stars of that high desert elevation, extravagantly many of them, the kind of sky that makes the scale of everything feel both enormous and somehow manageable. At her door, he took her hand and held it for a moment, standing in the mild night air with the stars behind them and the quiet of the town around them. He did not kiss her that night. He was patient, and also he was engaged in a very particular kind of uncertainty about what she wanted that he did not want to get wrong. She solved this 2 evenings later by the direct method she brought to everything she found important. He was on her porch again. He seemed to arrive at her porch most evenings now, which he was aware constituted a pattern and a kind of declaration, and she was telling him about a letter she had received from the federal court confirming Hargrove's indictment on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder after the fact, and Dutch Carver's separate indictment for the murder itself. She told him the details and he listened, and when she was done there was a moment of quiet in which the satisfaction of a thing properly concluded settled over both of them like the evening cooling. And then she turned to him and said, simply, "Are you going to kiss me, Lionel, or not?" He kissed her. It was not tentative. He had been patient, not uncertain about his feelings, only about the timing, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, her hand coming up to his jaw, and it was one of those moments that recalibrate a person at some level below consciousness, the kind that you do not return from the same as you arrived. They stood on her small porch in the darkness and the stars and said nothing for a while, which seemed entirely adequate. The autumn came to Redrock Flats with its characteristic beauty. the mesas turning deeper colors, the nights sharp and clear, the air carrying that particular clean edge of desert cold that was different from the cold of the mountains or the plains. Minnie's sewing business had grown steadily. She had taken on alterations for half the town and had made dresses for 3 of the ranching family's wives, and her reputation for quality had reached enough of the surrounding settlements that occasionally a woman would come in on the supply wagon to commission something specific. She had settled into the town in the way that some people settle into places, not with a great announcement but with a gradual, undeniable presence, until it became difficult to remember what the place had been without her. She was on the committee for the school fundraiser. She helped Nora Finch with a complicated matter involving some of the hotel's linen. She argued with the supply merchant about the quality of his thread stock in a way that was direct enough to be startling but pleasant enough that the merchant actually improved his inventory. Lionel watched all of this with a pride that he did not entirely know what to do with and eventually stopped trying to manage. He was proud of her. It was as simple as that. He asked her to marry him at Christmas. The town had organized a small celebration at the church hall. A tree brought in from the mountains, candles, singing, the community gathering against the cold the way communities do. They were walking home from it, their breath making small clouds in the sharp December air, and he stopped on the road and turned to her and asked her without preamble, in the plain way that was native to him. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment in the starlight, her face tipped up toward his, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Yes," she said, as she always said the things that mattered to her clearly, without decoration, with the full weight of her meaning behind the word. He had bought the ring from the silversmith in Las Cruces. Santos had carried the commission and the payment, and it was a simple band with a small turquoise stone set in it, because turquoise was native to this land, and he had thought, when he commissioned it, that she would understand what he meant by choosing it. She looked at it on her hand and then looked at him and understood exactly what he had meant by it. They were married in February of 1884, on a clear and bitingly cold morning that turned into a brilliant, warm afternoon, because the desert in winter was unpredictable in the direction of beauty. The judge who performed the ceremony was a federal man from Albuquerque, not the compromised circuit judge, who had quietly resigned from his position under the weight of the federal investigation, and the church was full because the town had decided collectively that it liked Marshal Underwood and that it liked Minnie Collins and that it liked what they were to each other. Nora Finch cried. Ellen Crosby, who had testified at the federal hearings with a courage that had earned her considerable respect, sat in the second row and looked satisfied. Santos, who had ridden more miles than anyone in this story without being asked to, sat in the back in his best shirt. Minnie wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored wool with small buttons down the front, and a collar she had embroidered herself with a pattern she had designed, small desert flowers, because she had decided that if she was going to put her work on something for her wedding day, it was going to be work she was genuinely proud of. She looked beautiful in the way she always looked beautiful, directly, without effort, as though beauty was not something she performed but something she simply was when she was fully herself. Lionel looked at her during the ceremony with the expression of a man who is holding something very good very carefully, the particular quality of attention of someone who has learned not to take things for granted. She caught him looking and her eyes softened, and she pressed her lips together briefly to contain a smile. They moved into a better house, one of the more solid adobes at the quieter end of town, with a proper kitchen and a room that Minnie immediately claimed for her sewing, and a third room that was just space for now. Lionel brought his few things from the room above the hardware store, and found that they looked very little and sparse arranged against Minnie's more numerous and warmer accumulation of household items, and that the combination of the two created something that felt, unambiguously, like a home, which he had not lived in for a great many years and which felt, he discovered, considerably better than the alternative. The Hargrove trial concluded in the spring. Walt Hargrove was convicted of conspiracy and fraud and sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe. Dutch Carver was convicted of the murder of Davis Price and sentenced to hang, a sentence that was carried out with the formal, terrible efficiency of justice in the spring of 1884. Carl Meade received a 2-year sentence and served it, and when he came out, he went to Arizona and became, by various accounts that reached Redrock Flats over subsequent years, a different kind of man than he had been. The falsely claimed land was returned to its proper status. 2 homesteading families who had been displaced by Hargrove's fraudulent documents were able to make their claims properly. It was not a complete resolution of every injustice, these things never were, and the larger machinery of land corruption and power imbalance in the territory ground on in other places. But this particular injustice, in this particular place, had been answered. Minnie went to the cemetery with a small bunch of desert flowers she had picked on the road out to the mesa, and she sat beside Davis's grave for an hour, and when she came back she looked both lighter and quieter, the way people look when something they have been carrying is honestly set down. She told Lionel that evening that she thought Davis would have liked him. He said he thought he would have liked Davis. He was stubborn, she said, like me, and he was funny. He could make anyone laugh. She was quiet for a moment. He would have made a good uncle. Lionel looked at her across the table. She was looking at the lamp, not at him, but there was something in the way she had said it, a particular quality of certainty, not speculation. Minnie, he said. She looked at him then. Yes, she said, before you ask. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and the lamp burned warm between them. Their son was born in October of 1884, in the room at the back of the house that had been the spare room and was now not spare at all. He was a big, healthy boy with Minnie's dark hair and Lionel's gray eyes, a combination that seemed slightly improbable and was entirely delightful. They named him Davis. It had been Lionel's suggestion, offered quietly one evening, and Minnie had looked at him for a long moment with her eyes very bright and said yes, that was exactly right. Davis Underwood came into the world making his preferences known loudly and clearly, a personality trait that his mother received with perfect equanimity, and his father regarded with a wonder that he expressed by holding the boy for long stretches in the evenings, and looking at him with an expression that was not available in his usual repertoire. Nora Finch came with a meal train. Ellen Crosby came with quilts she had made over the winter. Santos came with a carved wooden rattle and the slightly abashed manner of a young man paying his respects and not quite sure of the protocol. Lionel thanked him properly, and Minnie told him he must come to dinner soon, which he did, and which established a recurring practice that continued for years. The town settled into the life that follows resolved crises. The Hargrove operation was broken up, its range land redistributed through proper legal channels over the following years, and smaller ranchers and homesteaders moved into the gaps. Redrock Flats grew, not dramatically but steadily, the way towns in the territory were growing as the railroad pushed in and the territory edged toward statehood. A second general store opened. A doctor came who was more honest than Doc Hendricks, though Hendricks himself seemed to have been given a conscience by the entire affair and practiced with more integrity thereafter. Lionel continued as marshal. He was reappointed at the end of his term without opposition because the town had seen what he was made of and was not inclined to waste it. His work was less dramatic after Hargrove, the normal pattern of a frontier town, disputes and petty crime, and the occasional serious matter that he handled with the same methodical thoroughness. But he found that he minded the reduced excitement considerably less than he would have predicted. He had, it turned out, been hungrier for ordinariness than he had understood. The ordinary life was better than he had given it credit for when he had not had it. Minnie's sewing business grew to the point that she took on a young woman as an apprentice, a girl of 16 named Rosa, whose family had come up from Chihuahua, and settled on one of the former Hargrove sections. Rosa was quick and talented, and Minnie taught her with the directness and patience that characterized everything she did. Rosa later opened her own dressmaking establishment in Las Cruces, which Minnie received with the mixture of pride and slight wistfulness that comes from watching someone you have taught go off to exceed you. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1886, a girl with Lionel's gray eyes and her own very particular personality from the first moment. They named her Clara, after Minnie's mother. She was quieter than Davis and more watchful, and she had, from very early, the quality that Lionel recognized as fundamentally his own, the habit of observing before speaking, of cataloging things carefully before rendering a judgment. He found, to his astonishment, that watching this quality in his daughter was like being handed a mirror that showed something kinder than the reflection he was accustomed to seeing. Davis, at nearly 2, regarded his sister with the profound skepticism of a person whose position in the household has been unexpectedly complicated. And then, over the following weeks, with a growing and eventually total devotion that never really wavered for the rest of his life. Lionel sat on the porch of the house one evening in late summer of 1886 with Clara in the crook of his arm, 3 weeks old and asleep, and Davis on his knee pulling at the fringe of the blanket with enormous concentration, and Minnie beside him in the other chair with her feet tucked up and a book in her lap, not reading it, just resting, looking out at the western light doing its nightly work on the mesa. It occurred to him, sitting there, that the life he was inside was a better one than anything he had had the imagination to specifically want during all the years he had been alone. He had wanted, in a vague way, not to be solitary. He had not known to want this particular warmth and weight and mess and grace, this evening on this porch with these people, the baby's small solid weight in his arm and his son's warm weight on his knee and Minnie beside him, present and real and entirely herself. He said, "I am glad you did not get on that stage." She looked at him with those brown eyes that he had known for 3 years now and still found himself looking at because they were honest and warm and entirely hers. "I could not have," she said. "You told them I stayed. I did. You were very certain about it." "I was." He looked out at the mesa. "I was certain about you from the moment you walked into that hotel parlor with your carpet bag and your satchel and those eyes that were filing everything away." He paused. "I did not know I was certain, but I was." She was quiet for a moment. Clara made the small sound that babies make in their sleep. Davis had successfully extracted the fringe from the blanket and was examining it with the satisfaction of completion. "I was not certain at first," Minnie said honestly. "I was worried you might be like everyone else." She looked at her hands. "You were not like everyone else." "Neither were you," he said. She looked at him. The evening light was doing the thing it did. The amber and rose, the mesa going deep red, the sky behind it turning colors that no painter had fully captured, because no painter had quite been able to convince themselves the colors were real. In that light, in this particular moment, everything that had happened to bring them here, the death and the grief and the danger and the long process of 2 cautious people learning to trust, settled into something that was not erased but was redeemed, made into the material of something good. "I love you, Lionel," she said, simple and direct as she said everything that mattered. "I love you," he said, and meant it with every particular and practical and emotional part of himself. The whole assembled person that he had spent 34 years building largely in the dark, and that had, in the last 3 years, finally been given somewhere to stand. Davis Underwood dropped the fringe and looked up at his father with wide gray eyes, and Lionel smiled down at him, that surprised, genuine smile that Minnie had first caused him to produce on a Sunday morning on her porch, and the small boy laughed, because it was funny when his father smiled. It was one of the best and most reliable things in the world. The years that followed were full of the good ordinary things. Lionel's reputation in the territory grew not from any single dramatic act but from the accumulation of consistent, honest work over time, and when the territory began its serious move towards statehood in the late 1880s, his name was among those mentioned for positions in the coming state law enforcement structure. He did not pursue these with great ambition. He had what he had. It was enough. It was more than enough. Minnie's work evolved. She had always been interested in the commercial side of things, and she developed, over the years, a small but profitable operation supplying made goods to the stores in the larger nearby towns, organized with the meticulous efficiency that had always characterized her. She taught Rosa. She taught other young women who came to learn. She served on the school board when Redrock Flats built its proper schoolhouse, and she was not a gentle presence on that board, which produced better outcomes than gentle presences usually do. They had a third child in 1889, another boy, strong and loud, who they named John after Lionel's father, whom Lionel had not seen in 12 years, and to whom this birth seemed like the right occasion for a letter that was somewhat overdue. His father wrote back from Iowa with the warmth of someone who had been waiting to be reached, and was relieved to be found still there. Davis grew into a serious, capable boy who wanted to understand how everything worked, and who asked Lionel questions about the law with an intensity that suggested the answer had better be good. Clara was quieter in public and fiercer in private, and she could beat both her brothers at chess by the time she was 9, which she did with a composure that was clearly her father's and an undisguised pleasure that was clearly her mother's. John simply ran everywhere and loved everything, and brought a kind of uncomplicated energy to the household that the others appreciated more than they always admitted. The territory of New Mexico moved toward statehood. The West changed around Redrock Flats. The railroad arrived. The cattle industry consolidated and formalized. The wild edges that had defined the region in 1883 softened and became something more structured. Lionel watched these changes with the attention he brought to everything, adapting his work as the nature of the work adapted. One evening in the spring of 1891, Lionel and Minnie walked out to the edge of town as they had done so many times to look at the mesa in the evening light. They walked the way they had been walking for years, with her hand in his, comfortable with the silence and with the speech and with everything in between. Davis was 11 now. Clara was 5. John was 2 and had been left with Nora Finch, who was his devoted admirer and asked nothing better than to be left with him. "Do you ever think about going somewhere else?" Minnie asked. He looked at her. "No," he said. "Do you?" She thought about it honestly, which she always did. "Not anymore," she said. "I used to. In the first months I was not sure if I was staying because it was right or because of what had happened here, and it seemed wrong to leave." She looked at the mesa. "I stopped feeling that way after Davis was born. This is home. Davis is buried here." "Yes," he said. "And you are here," she said, with the small smile that was entirely hers, the one that held warmth and self-awareness and something a little wry, the smile of a woman who has examined her own heart carefully and is not ashamed of what she found there. "I am here," he said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture he had developed over the years without quite planning to, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she had been leaning into his shoulder for 7 years, with the ease of perfect familiarity and the warmth of something that had never stopped being chosen. The light was doing the thing it always did, extravagant, honest, making everything it touched look briefly extraordinary and then less briefly, and then simply true. They stood there together in the fading amber of a New Mexico evening, this proud marshal who had planted his feet in a doorway and refused to be moved, and this woman who had come a long distance carrying a letter and a grief and more courage than most men Lionel had ever known, and everything that had brought them to each other, the dark and the danger and the hidden motives and the forced choices and the secrets that had needed bringing into the light, all of it had served its purpose and delivered them here. Here, where the children were at home and the town was at peace and the mesa turned its deep, reliable red in the evening, and the man who had once been the most solitary person in Redrock Flats held his wife's hand in the desert dusk and understood, with the quiet certainty that was native to him, that he was not solitary anymore and had no intention of ever being so again. "She stays in this town," he had said. "And so do I," and so they did. Both of them, together. For all the years that followed, which were many and good,